Today on the Locked On Blues podcast, the St. Louis Blues recently announced that they hired Craig MacTavish as their new assistant coach, coming in and replacing Jim Montgomery, who was hired as the head coach of the Boston Bruins. Alexi Toropchenko recently received shoulder surgery that's going to keep him out of the beginning of the season. Plus, the NHL draft is right around the corner, so I'm going to be giving my initial thoughts on what I think the Blues should do, what they should go after. Before going into a more deeper dive on the draft in tomorrow and Thursday's episode, make sure you stay tuned.
You're Locked On Blues, your daily podcast on the St. Louis Blues. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Locked On Blues podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, and your number one source for daily Blues content. I'm your host, Josh Hyman, as always, and I got a good episode for you today. Lots to talk about with the NHL draft right around the corner. Before I get into that, though, I want to let you guys know that today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, so the NHL draft is on Thursday, July 7th. Just wanted to sort of give you guys a preview of where I'm going to be going with things this week. Took yesterday off, 4th of July. Hope everybody had a great holiday, great 4th of July. Spent some time with family, all that fun stuff. But yeah, so today I'm sort of going to be talking about half the episode, going to be talking about basic Blues news, MacTavish and Toropchenko, and what that sort of means for the roster next season. And then second half of the episode, I'm going to be giving my initial take on the draft, not really bringing up any specific names or anything or any players I think the Blues should take, more so just talking about should they move back in the draft, should they pick a defenseman, should they pick a forward, that sort of thing. And then tomorrow's episode, Wednesday, which is the day before the draft, I'm going to be looking at a few different names I would like the Blues to take, and then I'm going to be doing the same thing on Thursday. Depending on what time, I'm free or whatever, maybe the Thursday episode will be a post-draft reaction, or maybe that'll be Friday's episode. I don't know. Stay tuned for that, though. But before I jump into the draft stuff, we do got some news to talk about, and that is the fact that the Blues hired Craig MacTavish to be their assistant coach following Jim Montgomery's departure. It was great, in in the episode that I talked about on Friday, I believe, which is the day that MacTavish was hired. I said that I wouldn't be surprised to see that role be filled from within. And then, sure enough, less than an hour after I finished recording, the Blues proved me wrong, and they hired Craig MacTavish, who is definitely not an inner hire. Craig MacTavish is a guy that has a ton of NHL experience, from being a player to being a head coach to being a general manager, and pretty much everything in between. And that's what I think is really important in this hire. Doug Armstrong was on record. He basically said, yeah, with MacTavish's experience, they call him Mac T, which I think is pretty great. With Mac T's experience, there's nothing that he hasn't seen. And I think that is something that is really, really crucial for that role. He has a ton of experience. Like I was saying, he played for a long time. He coached for a long time, but he was also a general manager. So he's seen the game from many different levels. He's seen it from the ice level as a player. What it takes to be successful as a player. He's seen it as a head coach, what it takes to be successful as a head coach to run the team. But then also he's seen it from a general manager's perspective of like, how do you build a team? How do you keep everybody happy? How do you create a product that is going to compete night in, night out on the ice? And having that much knowledge and also clearly that much love for the game, which I don't think you can deny his love for the game. The fact that he's been around the game as long as he has is going to be huge for the Blues. And as much as it's a difficult role to fill, Montgomery did so much for the Blues. He made their special teams unit so strong. I think MacTavish might have even broader of a knowledge than Jim Montgomery. Yeah, I don't think he's quite as much of an expert at the little things like Montgomery was. I don't know if our power play and our penalty kill is going to be as specialized as it was under Jim Montgomery, but the other aspects of it, maybe the defense, maybe, other areas, I'm not sure, but other areas that MacTavish has more experience with just due to his sheer volume of hockey that he has been around playing, coaching, managing, et cetera, et cetera. Like Doug Armstrong said, there's nothing that he hasn't seen. So, who knows? Maybe he goes out there week 1 and sees the Blues defense starting and be like, "Oh yeah, this is just like that Oilers team I coached back in 2003." I don't know if I have the years correct, but you know what I mean. There's very good chance that any problems the Blues run into, MacTavish has already seen at some point in his tenure as a player, coach, or general manager. That's the benefit when you get a guy that has that much experience, that much tenure, just being around the game as much as he has. So I like that a lot. I think that that's exactly what the Blues needed in their coaching staff. It's just some experience. Craig Berube is a guy that doesn't have a ton of experience behind the bench, that sort of thing. Obviously he's done a great job, but when it comes to deeply experienced as coaches and stuff, the Blues don't necessarily have that quite as much as some other teams. So bringing in MacTavish, I think, is going to be great and fill that role and just sort of provide that veteran leadership behind the bench that maybe I don't want to say the Blues have been missing that, but that can help any team out. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what he can do in that role. I don't think he's ever been an assistant coach. I think he's only ever been a head coach or general manager. I could be wrong there though, or at least he hasn't been one recently. So I'm going to be interested to see how he takes on that role. Should be exciting. Should be fun to see. And like I said, I'm looking forward to it a lot. Now, in this upcoming second segment, I'm going to be talking about the unfortunate surgery for Alexi Toropchenko, a guy that I thought was going to make a pretty big impact next season. He still could, but it won't be till I think like December-ish when he recovers from his injury. So we're going to be talking about that and more. Make sure you stay tuned. Before I get into that, I want to tell you guys about betonline.net. Now, betonline.net is your number one source for all your betting needs and sports info. You can find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's NHL playoffs. I don't know why it still says that. Well, this year's MLB season, I should be saying. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sporting wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. And BetOnline.net remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite sports and events, including MMA, boxing, and even golf. So head to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. Bet online where the game starts. And I'll be right back with the second half of today's episode. All right, so news came out over the weekend that young stud Alexi Toropchenko, a guy who really turned some heads in the playoffs and impressed me down the stretch of the regular season as well, unfortunately is receiving shoulder surgery that is going to keep him out for the beginning of next season for the St. Louis Blues, and that really stinks. He's a guy that showed a lot of strides, a lot of promise for the Blues, and now he's missing out on a full offseason of training and improving, and also missing out on training camp and the start of the season. That's very frustrating for him, and I think for us as fans as well, and for the Blues organization as a whole. I think he's a guy that they had a lot of faith in that could come in and be an impact player, in that bottom six, or even in that middle six. And the fact that he's going to be sidelined for at least a few months to start the season is definitely pretty disappointing. And that sort of ties into the whole draft discussion of the transition of power between the older guys and the younger guys on the team. Even though the Blues core guys are up there in age, Ryan O'Reilly, David Perron, the defensive core, the goaltending is getting close to 30. I think if you look at this roster and look past that, you see that the Blues have a pretty darn good young core in place. In Jordan Kyrou, Robert Thomas, soon to be Jake Neighbors, Zachary Bolduc, Scott Perunovich, Joel Hofer, Colton Ellis. Like, they've got a lot of young names that I think are pretty exciting. So Alexi Toropchenko, I think, is a perfect sort of bridge between the older group and the younger group. He's a little bit older than some of the younger prospects like Bolduc and Neighbors. He's got, a little bit more NHL experience than those guys. But also, you got guys like Robert Thomas and Jordan Kyrou that are still just a bit ahead of Toropchenko. So I think Toropchenko is a really good example of sort of who's up next for the St. Louis Blues. Like, he most likely isn't going to turn into a superstar player, putting up 70, 80 points a season, but he's the type of guy that every team needs, a middle six, bottom six guy, grinder, plays his role well, plays responsibly, does all the right things out there. And, it's pretty easy to look at prospects and just assume the highest ceiling for them and just say, oh yeah, he's looking great. He could be a first line center or a first line winger or a first pairing defenseman. And anytime that the players don't do that, it can almost be seen as disappointing. I think every fan base has a tendency to sort of hype up their own prospects more than they actually deserve. So that way, when they don't turn into a Robert Thomas or a Jordan Kyrou, it's inevitably a letdown or a failure, which that's not the case. There's 4 lines on an NHL team, on an NHL offense, and there are 3 pairings on defense. And some prospects are going to turn into a 4th line guy or a 3rd line guy or a 3rd pairing defense guy or a backup goalie or whatever. And that's really important. Look at the Tampa Bay Lightning. Look at the Colorado Avalanche. They have a lot of youth in their depth. They don't just have a deep roster. They have a deep young roster. They got guys that are younger that play on the 4th line, that play on the 3rd line, that play on their 3rd pairing defense, whatever, what have you. Successful teams have a lot of depth and have a lot of youth at that depth. So that way, you can save a little bit of money on those bottom few positions. So that's what I think the Blues are going to miss most out of Toropchenko is having that youthful exuberance in your bottom 6 of your lineup can sort of bring a different energy than when you fill up your bottom 6 with veterans, which, there's nothing wrong with that. The Blues had a veteran bottom 6 core and won a Stanley Cup with it. So, I'm not saying it's the worst thing in the world for the Blues, but I think their bottom 6 is definitely going to miss out. And I think in general, the Blues are going to miss out on Toropchenko's presence. He looked really, really good against Colorado there towards the tail end of that series, and had his moments in the tail end of the regular season as well. Because of that, I think that the Blues are pretty bummed by this injury and this surgery, but also the fact that they maybe elected to get this procedure means that they want to get him back in the lineup as soon as possible. And they're putting him through the best treatment, the best rehab in order to get him healthy and back in the lineup as soon as possible. I think that they have pretty high hopes for him, so I'm looking forward to seeing what he can do on top of the other younger guys. And that brings up the question. I saw someone post on the Blue subreddit: do we think Jake Neighbors will get a shot now that Alexi Toropchenko is injured? And that's interesting because I think you're not going to bring Jake Neighbors into the roster if you're planning on only using him until Alexi Toropchenko gets healthy. I think if Jake Neighbors makes the roster, he's going to be a guy that's, suiting up every single night, because if he's not going to be suiting up every single night, you don't want to have him, wasting time in the press box. You'd rather have him in the AHL or in juniors, growing and developing there. So I don't think you could pencil in Jake Neighbors as a permanent spot on this team. He did earn the 9 games last season and looked pretty darn good in them. But I don't think, it's a guarantee that he has a roster spot next season. The forward core is still very deep, even if somehow the Blues lose David Perron, which I don't think is going to happen, but could happen. Even if they lose a guy like David Perron, or, even with Toropchenko's injury, the forward core is still just as deep as it was last season. And it's the same forward core that Jake Neighbors just couldn't quite crack, mostly just due to him, like I said, it'd be better off him getting that experience in juniors / the AHL, rather than, playing 1 out of every 3 games or something like that in the NHL. And unless he has taken some immense strides, which he very well might have, and I mean, he had a great season down in juniors. He captained his team to a WHL championship. So, there's no reason to believe that he might not have taken or there's no reason to believe that, there's no reason to believe he didn't take a huge step this offseason this season in terms of growth and NHL readiness. And I'm absolutely not ruling out him coming into camp and just blowing everyone's minds and being spectacular and earning a roster spot. That would be great. And he's the type of guy that I think can do that. He's got experience beyond his years. He was the captain of a championship winning team. Very well liked within his organization. And those are the little things that can sort of get you that extra push needed to make a roster. You can have all the skill in the world, but if you're not ready, you're not going to make the roster. And I don't want to say Jake Neighbors wasn't ready last year, but I think that played a part in it. I think, skill wise, he was right there, but it was just better for him to develop, where he could get more playing time. And I think this year he's got a much better chance of making the roster long term, just because of that experience and obviously because of the skill that he has. But I'm not guaranteeing it, especially because, once Toropchenko comes back, that sort of creates a logjam. But hey, who knows? It could be one of those things where he basically forces his way onto the roster and has a really strong season. I would love to see that. So anyways, speaking of young guys, the NHL draft is right around the corner. So in this third segment, I'm going to head to it a little bit early because I got a lot to talk about, what I think the Blues should do, all that fun stuff. Make sure you stay tuned after this ad break. Okay, so Thursday, July 7th. Right now it is Tuesday, July 5th. Thursday, July 7th is the NHL draft. Sort of snuck up on me. Been so busy lately with work and all that stuff. offseason has flown by. The rest of the playoffs flew by, and now here we are. Draft is right around the corner, which means free agency is also right around the corner, but not going to be getting into that quite yet because, like I said, the draft, it's here. The Blues are going to be picking at 23rd overall as of now. Definitely an earlier pick than they're somewhat used to. I think last year they picked, I don't remember. I don't remember where they picked last year, like 20 or something like that, and it was the highest pick that they had in a long time. The Blues often find themselves picking at 25 or later because they've been so good for the past few years. So a little bit earlier in the draft than they're used to, tiny bit. And because of that, I'm excited to see who they could go after. The question that I'm going to be pretty much talking about today, I'm not going to be going into names yet of guys that I think they should take. I want to do a little bit more research before I do that. But I'm going to be just thinking about what the Blues need long term. Now, Doug Armstrong had an interview where he talked about his plans for the draft, and there were a few things I wanted to go over. So the first thing that he said was they're not going to move up unless something miraculous happens, which makes sense. The Blues aren't really a team that needs to move up in the draft right now unless a guy like Connor McDavid slips to the 17th pick and they want to jump up 6 spots. But anyone that they pick on the draft, project player, anyone that late in the draft is likely going to be a project player. That's another thing that Doug Armstrong talked about. If you're at the 23rd pick, you're looking at a guy that's going to be 3 years away, 2 if he gets a bit of a fast track. And he also said something like, when we're talking about picking guys that late in the first round, we're not talking about them making an NHL roster just to be there. We're talking about them being able to come in and contribute and playing, 10, 13 minutes a night and playing well. So it doesn't sound like they have too much of a desire for a young guy that can come in and fill the roster right away, which makes sense. This is a team that was 2 wins away from defeating the eventual Stanley Cup champion in the second round of the playoffs. Obviously hindsight is 2020 and whatever, the Blues were definitely outclassed by the Colorado Avalanche, but still there's clearly a good roster there. There's clearly no need to immediately try to fill some needs at the draft. But that being said, with some of the guys getting up in age like Ryan O'Reilly, David Perron, the defensive core is going to be on the wrong side of 30 sooner rather than later, et cetera, et cetera. Like, there's definitely a need to fill some not immediate gaps, but some gaps that are pretty apparent that are going to exist in a few seasons' time. And that's why I think when people point at the Blues and how they have such a lack of defensive depth in terms of their youth, people say, "Oh yeah, they should take a defenseman this year." I don't know if I'm too bought in on that. Like, obviously, I think in terms of initial needs, defenseman, yeah. If you're picking a guy that is going to be a really good player, then you go for a defenseman because that's the Blues' biggest need right now. But then you also look at, like I said, the forward group and the fact that besides, Ryan or besides Robert Thomas, Jordan Kyrou, Jake Neighbors, Zach Bolduc, those guys, there are definitely some holes there as well. And because of that, I think the Blues are going to sort of take a best player available approach. I think if they pick a defenseman, which first of all, they haven't picked a defenseman in the first round since 2012, and that was Jordan Schmaltz, and we all know how that went. Picked him at I think 25, so right around where they're going to be picking this year. But the Blues notoriously aren't that great at picking first round defensemen, probably why they haven't done it in 10 years. And they've also kind of had success finding defensemen outside of the first round. Colton Parayko was like a third rounder. Torrey Krug, Justin Falk were all brought in from the outside. Stuff like that. So because of that, I would almost lean more towards the Blues taking a forward. But I think it really comes down to best player available. I think there are some really solid names around the 23rd pick in the draft. And Doug Armstrong said in that interview, he basically said there are some guys that they're really, really excited about that they think are going to be there at 23. But if those guys aren't there at 23, then they're going to think about moving back with teams that have multiple picks in the late 20s or something like that, which is interesting. If the 23rd pick could be worth like the 28th and 33rd pick or something crazy like that, that says a lot about, the disparity between the top 23 picks and then the next 20 picks or whatever, if that's what Doug Armstrong was alluding to. So if I'm the Blues, I honestly would prefer to add 2 pretty good prospects over 1 really good prospect. I know that doesn't really make much sense, like pretty good versus really good, but hear me out. So you got a chance to add one guy with a high ceiling but a low floor, or two guys with a lower ceiling but a higher floor. Two guys that you know are going to be able to be uh, productive and come in and likely fill a roster spot in 3 years' time, versus one guy who might turn into the next Vladimir Tarasenko, late round or late first round draft pick that turns out to be a stud, or maybe he turns out to be the next Ty Ratty. And if you're asking yourself, who's Ty Ratty? Exactly. Um, and if I'm the St. Louis Blues, with the way that their roster is built and the way that they're planning on, contending even after the core turns over, I think I would prefer that they go out and get, you know, more surefire guys. And if that's a matter of trading back and getting, like I said, two guys that maybe don't have the potential as the first guy, but they're more likely, they're more of a sure thing. I say you take that route. I say you go for the sure thing that can at the very least be a third, fourth line forward or a third pairing defenseman versus a guy that might turn into a second or first line forward, first pairing defenseman, but also might just be a career AHLer. Um, I think those are more picks for teams that are rebuilding, teams that have a lot of options. And that's not what the Blues are. So I'm looking forward to the draft. I'm looking forward to talking about it and tomorrow's episode, sort of diving into some of the names I like around the 23rd pick. Should be a lot of fun. I love the draft. I love prospects. All that stuff is so exciting. So make sure you stay tuned because I'll be covering all that for you here on the Locked On Blues podcast. That being said, though, is all the time I have for you today. So make sure you hit that follow or subscribe button on whatever podcast platform you're listening to me on. Hit that subscribe button on the YouTube channel at Locked On Blues and the notification bell. That way, whenever a new video gets uploaded, which is usually, well, actually now they're around the same time as the audio uploads. I've been scheduling them 6 p.m. Eastern every day. I'm trying to get into more of a schedule, posting the episodes at the same time every day. I hope that drives a little bit more traffic. So yeah, 6 p.m. Eastern most days. It might be different the day of the draft because the draft is, I think, like 7 or 8. So I might upload one a little bit earlier or a little bit later, depending on how my day goes. But yeah, 6 p.m. Eastern for the near future. Look out for that. Like I said, trying to get on more of a schedule. Follow Locked On Blues on all of the social accounts, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at Locked On Blues. You can follow my Twitter at Josh Hyman NHL. Thanks so much for listening. And as always, let's go Blues.